guys have been watching my previous videos or just watching the things that I tend to post on my page, you know that I am quite fond of doing pen and ink with watercolor designs because I love the sharp black edges around the edges of things. So I do things like that with the mouse, or that with the mouse. I'm fond of my little mouse person. Alright, that one doesn't have a mouse in it. That just is a tree. And a friend of mine's daughter is pregnant, so I was thinking about doing a little baby mouse picture for her. So let's see what kind of idea we come up with. If you want to see something particular, we'll probably do 2 paintings during this session because we've got 3 hours. So if you've got something you'd like me to tackle for the second painting, let me know. Oh, and I suppose I'll also mention that there's a really cool challenge going on right now for the months of January, February, March, and the Blackstone Valley Art Association has posted about it on their website. So if you go to bvaa.org, you can see it on the website. So the idea is that over the next 3 months, for January, February, and March, you paint 30 paintings. And they're little paintings, so you're working on 30 little paintings, one every 3 days or so. And the idea is to try different styles, to try different techniques, and if something doesn't work, it's just a little short painting that you're testing with. So you can try watercolors with salt crystals, or you can try watercolors with squishy saran wrap, or you can do all sorts of different things. You could try acrylics one day, watercolors one day, pastels one day. So you should take a look at the bvaa.org site and take a look and maybe join in and have some fun with us. It's for all levels and abilities. It's not about making super detailed paintings because you've only got 3 days. The idea is just to have fun and have motivation to try different things, which is always a good thing to do. Alright, so what I was thinking of doing for my first painting is if we take a look at this other one I'd done of the mouse in the garden with the tulips. So that's an adult-sized mouse, although, it's sort of hard to tell. It could be a little mouse, for all we know. But I was going to do one sort of like that, but instead of having it with big tulips, I was going to have it with little dandelions with the little mouse, and then have the big mouse hanging out nearby, maybe reading a book or something like that. So, the first step when you are thinking about doing a painting is to lay out the design of the painting. And it's all different. Some people just start randomly and see what happens, especially if you're doing something abstract. But when I'm doing pen and ink, I like to sketch it out with pencil first to get an idea of what I'm going to do. And that's good because pencil can be erased if you decide that you've got something that you want to change. Because then once you put that ink down, the ink is fairly permanent, so you want to make sure that the design is set before you get to the inking stage. So I'm going to be doing pencil sketch first and then ink over it to set the design. And this is a waterproof ink. This, if you care about the technical one I've used, this is a Jelly Roll 06 Sakura. But all that really matters is that it's waterproof, because we're going to be watercolor painting on top of it. And if the pen was not waterproof, then once we started putting water, you get these giant smears of black everywhere, which is not the style I am going for. And then once the ink outline is done, then we're going to paint it in as if it was a coloring book. And I've got some brushes over here, which is casting these shadows over here. But you can, usually I just use one brush, so you don't need lots of brushes. I just happen to have a couple here for different purposes, but I will probably just be using this one particular brush because it's the one I like. As long as it's got a reasonably pointy tip, then it will do fine. Alright, so when you are drawing your picture, it's good to think about the rule of thirds, and it's just something about the way the human eye works as to what we find visually pleasing. So if you were to split this horizontally into thirds and then vertically into thirds, so imagine a grid line on there that has those pieces, the human eye tends to like it when objects fall onto those intersection points of those thirds, or along the line of the thirds. So it's generally good like not to put a horizon line straight across the middle of something that you're working on. It's good to have it in the upper third or in the lower third. So let's see, let's sketch it in the upper third. And I'm not talking about you have to be precise. I mean, you could grab a ruler if you want to, but the idea is just in general to have it about a third of the way down or about a third of the way up, or so on. Alright, so also in the West, or I suppose in the US we'll say, in the US and Europe, people are taught to read from left to right. And that's how their eye goes across things. They tend to look at the top left and then work their way down to the bottom right. And of course it depends when you lay out your picture where you have things bright and interesting as to where the eye is drawn. But if you think about that, then think about, you could put, if you're designing your own picture, you could think about putting the starting things that people might look at in the left side and then have their eye get drawn across to the right side. You know, and again, you can lay out things however you want to, but these are just different ideas. And the other thing I'll mention before I start drawing is in general, paintings get matted and framed, which means you're going to lose the very edges of your picture underneath the mat and frame. So don't put some sort of really important detail right up against the edge because it's probably going to be cut off a little bit. So always think about keeping your important things a little further in from the edge, and the edge can just have, you know, grass or trees or something else like that. Alright, so I'm going to put the baby in the leaf cradle over here on the left, and then I'm going to, I'm going to do it the other way, because I'm going to have the bigger mouse over here reading so that his eyes are looking across at the baby mouse, which will be over here sleeping, and I'll have the baby mouse angled so that it's looking back at the parent mouse. So if we go down here to the third, and we want to keep it again a little away from the margin, so we'll put in dandelion here with its fluffy top, and it's a baby, so it's not going to be too big. Dandelion there, just trying to keep track of where that third is. And again, I'm doing very light for the pencil sketch, trying to do it a little darker than usual so that you guys can see it on the video. But the pencil sketch is just a guideline for me so that when I then put the pen down, I'm able to see where I want to draw. But then we've got a leaf. And then the string. That's the bottom of the leaf. Now, babies tend to have big heads and big eyes. We'll make this a sleeping baby, something everyone cherishes, although they're cute when they're awake too. A little smiling sleepy baby. Alright, so we got a smiling sleepy baby with the dandelions. It's a little higher than the third. That's alright. It will do. And then over here, you will have an Adirondack chair. Adirondack. I'll draw the chair first. Head with the mouse. Right, that's not quite the round shape we were thinking of. So what are you guys up to today? Are you drawing something? Are you just hanging out? Let me know. big ears, big eyes. Smiling. The nice thing with the pencil too is that you don't need to worry about lines crossing each other or all those other kinds of things. You can just sort of work out where you want the different pieces to go. And make adjustments. Alright, so we got the mouse sitting and relaxing. We got the little baby snoozing. I want a ladybug in here somewhere. Hello, kitten. You can come over and say hello. Now is a fine time to do it before we don't have wet watercolor paints all over the place. You're gonna come step on the baby mouse picture. You're just gonna stick your head everywhere because that's what the cat does. That's alright. Yes, you're a good kitty. Good kitty. Oh, sweetie. Alright. Giving the cat that pencil. Let the go hang out somewhere else for now. Alright, what else am I going to put in here? What is the ladybug going to be doing? I suppose Ladybug can be reading too. Well, Ladybug could be taking a nap. What should Ladybug be doing? Well, we'll make Ladybug be sleeping. Give them a little mat. A little book. They fell asleep while reading their book. That is alright. Alright. I think that is fine for the basics. Alright, so once you've got something sketched in, starting to think maybe I wanted to do them a little larger, but that's alright. Oh, now I got the second cat. Second cat is going to come stuff their face into the watercolor water while it's nice and fresh. You can drink some now if you want to. While it's fresh. Yes, yes, it's water. Water is lovely to drink. So the first one was Zuzu. The second one is Felix. Oh hey, Melanie. Melanie, what I'm drawing is, it's along the style of this, which is a mouse in a tulip field taking a nap. But what I'm going to do to it is make a version that has, it's a little light that I'm going to draw in the pen shortly so you'll be able to see it. It's a baby mouse in a leaf cradle with dandelions, and then the adult mouse is over here reading a book, keeping an eye on them, and then my little ladybug is over there taking a nap. So you'll see better when I start drawing the pen and ink in, but you can draw whatever you want to do. You don't have to do what I'm doing. I'm just trying to wait until all my cats, I've got one cat on my mouse pad, there we go, and the other cat is going off. Don't step on the keyboard. Good kitten. Use Louise. So Here I will click on here and hit reply in case you didn't happen to hear my reply. I'm doing a pen and ink of a mouse baby with an adult mouse reading in watercolor. You color it in. Alrighty. Alright, so I've got the pencil sketch done, and you can sit there and erase pieces and add pieces, and I could redo the whole thing so it's a little larger, but I'm not going to bother for right now because we're just showing you how this works. Alright, so now we're going to do pen over it, and I can adjust it down a little bit while I'm working on the pen. So we'll do the stalk of the dandelion. And I'm not going to do in the fluffy white part because I want that to stay very light and fluffy and not dark and inky. But we'll do all the rest of the design. Alright, so those are the two stems for the dandelions. Now I'm going to start with the leaf shape. So that's the stem up there. Alright. Leaf. Leaf is tied over into the stems. Alright, now we get the baby mouse. Has a big head. So as I mentioned before, in the pencil drawing stage, you can be loose and free because you can just easily erase pencil. But when you get to the ink drawing stage, when you're doing pen and ink, you want to be a little careful because ink is very bright. And it would be hard to erase. You want to make sure that wherever you put the ink is where you actually want to have ink. Alright, we got baby mouse. We got the stems. Alright, let's go over to, let's do the ladybug next. The ladybug has a blanket. We got a little hook there. Alright. Got a little sleeping ladybug. And then we got the parent. The face is a little flat looking, so see, this is the sort of thing. You want to fix it before you get to the ink stage. So the head should be a little rounder. A little rounder. Like that. Alright, that looks better. Otherwise we'll take the time to fix it. So how are you guys all doing? Enjoying your Saturday? I look forward to Saturdays. I work from home, so I work pretty much every day. So it's not as if Saturday in that sense is different from other days. But Saturday is the day that I make sure I set aside the mornings for doing these arts and paintings, and I find it just so relaxing. Alright, chair, leg, chair, leg, arm, book. Alright, so I think you get the gist of the design. So now we start thinking about the colors to put in on this. So we're going to do two different techniques when we're painting this in. The first thing we're going to do is all the background. And if you look at this one, in general you want the background not to compete with what's in your foreground for the person's attention. So a soft fuzzy background does a good job of laying out the scene and landscape without doing something that will clutter the image so that your eye has too many things to try to look at. So when I do this sort of background, I'll do it wet on wet, which means I'll make the paper wet and then I will paint the watercolor in while the paper is wet, and that causes the watercolor to soften and spread out, and that gives that gentle kind of look to it. So let us start with that. I'm just looking for some sort of backing to put underneath the watercolor so that as I start to do things I don't get paint all over my desk. There we go. Let me just check that that's still reasonably in the frame. Yep. That's fine. Especially when I get to the spattering stage. It's better not to spatter everything all over my desk, although this desk has certainly had enough art stuff all over it over the months. But it's better not to make it too completely cluttered. Alright, so wet on wet. First I'm going to do the top third. Remember we talked about we're using the rule of thirds to divide the image up into visual zones, we'll call them. So this top third is going to be the rest of the garden. And I'm going to put in probably some tulips and things. Dandelions are a springtime event. And I suppose people often think about babies as being a springtime thing. Alright, so we will draw a couple of stalks back here. When you're painting wet on wet, the paint will spread and drift, but it'll do it in the wet. The wet water will draw the images out, but you see it won't spread down here into the dry part. So it's a good way, if you make a section of this wet, you'll know that that wet area will all spread and get color, but it'll generally leave the dry stuff alone. And don't worry about cat hairs that get in there, they could just brush away afterwards. It's good to use a few different colors in your picture because in real life everything isn't just one color. But it's also good to use colors that reasonably go well together so that there's a sense of harmony in the image. So we'll put some tulip heads up here. Orange one. You notice that the paper is buckling a little. Watercolor paper has this tendency, when it starts to get wet, to stretch. And a lot of people will pre-wet all of the paper, so they will paint the entire back with water, and then the entire front with water, and then tape it down so it's flat. But this is a sketchbook that I'm using, and the idea with it is that you just go out, you do quick sketches, you get a sense of something. So I am fine with it doing this kind of buckling. It's just, I mean, it happens all the time to me anyway, so I suppose I'm sort of used to it. So if you really didn't want to have that happen and wanted it to be super flat for some reason, then you would pre-wet everything first, you would tape it down, and that way you will not have it do this kind of curling stuff. But I mean, really all it means is that the water flows a little differently, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. Alright. Put in some little dots. And again, the idea is not that these are specific in any way at all. It's just giving the sense that there's gardening stuff behind the scene. But you don't want people to be focusing on this gardening stuff over here. You want it to be a backdrop. Alright, so I think you get the sense of that. It's just sort of an idea that there's flowers and other soft things back there. Part of why I did the top first. Oh, hey Laura, good to see you. Alright, so for the bottom part, I'm just going to put like a meadow, so it's going to be a more soft, stable grass. And again, I'm just going to paint in with water. And I'm going to paint around the areas that I want to be the actual focal items later. That means I'm also going to not paint on the white dandelion heads. In watercolor, the color white generally comes from the white of the paper. You generally don't paint white in. So anything that you want to be white, you don't paint at all, you leave it white. So you want to think about that when you're making your painting and making sure that anything that you want to be white, you leave white from the first place. And generally in watercolors, you can see through all the paints to lower levels. So if I wanted something to be green, I wouldn't paint it red and then think that I could paint green over the top of it later. Watercolors doesn't really work like that. So you want to think about what you're going to paint where. And when you're doing this wet on wet technique, this water can dry fairly quickly. So you have to paint fairly quickly if you want to have stuff go into this wet area. I mean, you can re-wet it, but if you want something to flow and move through this whole area, you want to do it while this is wet. This area on the left is already starting to dry, so it's not flowing as much. And you can see how things are dripping down the hill of the curve. And again, that's alright. That's what I use this pad for. I use it for doing quick sketches. So I'm used to the paper turning and buckling like this. It's just part of the playing process. There's a cat hair in here, but I could pick that out later, so I got it. It doesn't matter if they stay in there, if you get brush hairs or cat hairs or anything like that. Alright, so we're just putting in a soft wash for the meadow. This is all just background information. Now, I'm being sort of careful about coming up against the garden part, because the thing with wet on wet is that the paint will flow right into another area that's wet, and that top area is still wet. Now it's all green, so it doesn't matter too much if we get some green meadow into the green of the grass, but they are sort of different. And I want to maintain that boundary between the meadow area and the garden area. Right, and you'll see that some areas are lighter and some areas are darker, and that's good. That gives a sense of texture, that there's little mounds of grass and all that kind of stuff. And it also is doing it fairly organically, and that also adds to the sense of just a soft meadow. Alright, so now I'm painting in around the edges of the dandelion stems. So again, I'm leaving the areas around the actual dandelion flowers empty, because the dandelion flowers are white, and I want to have those stay white. Alright. This one, so you can see the paint rolling down the hill of the paper, and that is fine. Another cat here. Funny how there's cat hairs all around, almost as if the cats were just climbing all over the paper and walking on them. Alright, maybe a little more green down here. Green in between there. So that's some more little cat hairs. Alright. There we go. Alright, I think I want this top area to be a little darker. One of the things you want to think about when making any sort of a painting or drawing is the contrast between darker areas and lighter areas. The human eye likes to have that kind of contrast going on. Gives it a sense of depth and realism and all those other kinds of things. So you want some darker areas, some lighter areas, and again, I don't want this to be too defined back here. But just a couple more things. When you're painting in watercolor, remember that whatever you paint, it's going to dry later. So often for darker things, you end up putting on multiple layers. You put on a layer, and then it dries, and then you put on another layer, and then it dries, and so on. Alright, there we go. So we got some darker areas. That also gave a chance for this lower stuff to dry. Put in a little more green right around the baby. So the paints will dry later than they go on. You want a range of lights, which are generally areas that you've only lightly painted in, to darks, which are areas that either you went over a couple times or that you used a lot of pigment. See, if I use a lot of pigment in here that isn't very watered down, it ends up being darker. And if you use a lot of water in the mix, so there's only a little bit of pigment and end up being lighter. So I'm going to make it a little darker on the edges. And the darker that you make it around a white area, the lighter the light areas seem in comparison. So if you have a light dandelion against a light background, it doesn't look too bright because the other areas are also bright. But the darker that you make this area around it, the more that the white stands out. So that part is about contrast. The white stands out more and more, the darker and more saturated that I get with the surrounding grass area. Alright, like that. There we go. I don't want it to be too sharp-edged. So the beauty of watercolors is that this paint is reacting to water. Means I can just go in there with a little more water and drag the colors around and that sort of thing. Alright, so let's darken this area up a little to match. And a lot of watercolor painting is about these layers. You put on the starting layer, get the general sense, then you start darkening up the layers and then darkening up layers and so on. And over time, you get the picture developing the way that you had it envisioned. Or sometimes it develops in a way that you hadn't envisioned and you have some happy accidents. So everything is a learning process, and that is good. It's good to keep learning and growing, exploring, trying things. Okay. Alright, so I got a gist of doing wet on wet. The idea with wet on wet is that the paper is wet, the paint that you put in is wet, and that allows the paint to flow and drift and merge in. It creates a soft, organic feel. And it is great for backgrounds, but there are times that you can do a whole painting wet and wet. If you have a field of poppies or something and you want to give it all a soft feel, wet on wet is perfect for that. Alright, so we got a meadowy background. We got just put a little darker in there, give it sort of a shadow sense. A little darker under the chair, give it a little shadow sense. Alright, so we've got excellent, Laura. So Laura's hanging out and listening to me, and usually I spend every Saturday afternoon hanging out and listening to Laura and painting along. So that's what we used to do in person at the Uxbridge Gallery. Now with the Uxbridge Gallery temporarily closed due to pandemic reasons, it's nice to be able to virtually hang out with our friends and relax and paint along from the comfort of our homes. Alright, so the top area is drying. I'm just going to add a few little more green things in. And what I'm doing in part is waiting for this lower green area to dry. Because again, if I start doing something wet in here with the mouse body while the green area is still wet, that gray from the mouse body could get sucked right out into the green if I let the two areas touch. And then we have gray moving out in our grasses, and that's not quite what my intention is here. So while I'm giving the green meadow a few minutes to dry, I'll sit here and poke away at the top area. What I do sometimes is have a second painting going so that I could work on the second painting while areas of the first painting are drying. But there's enough little white gaps in here in the upper area that I will poke away at these white gaps. Now the bottom area is drying. What are you guys doing this fine Saturday? Are you relaxing? Having some coffee or tea or something? Getting some chores done? I'll put in a couple more of these little red flowers. Well, again, the idea of the background is not that it draws your eye too much. You want your eye drawn to the main focal creatures, but just have something sort of interesting there in the back. Alrighty, I think the ladybug area looks dry, so I'll work on the ladybug area next. Alright, so the mice are green, the leaves are green, and the ladybug's going to be red. I'm going to put her against a yellow blanket so that the red stands out. You want to also think about colors. You know, this leaf's green, those stems are green, that background's green. So you've got green on green on green, so you at least need to use different greens so that the leaf stands out against the background of the green. And the same thing here. If the ladybug is red and black, you want the blanket that they're lying on to be some other different color so that you can make out the shape of the ladybug against the background of the blanket. So we'll give her a nice yellow blanket. A benefit of this pen and ink technique is that you create for yourself nice dark lines to paint along with. And this is especially good if you have someone in your household who wants to paint but isn't very good at drawing. You could have someone in the house who is reasonably good at drawing draw out some of the shapes, and then the other person can sit there and paint them in, sort of like their very own coloring book. So something to think about doing. And while I've got this, I will add some yellow to some of these flowers. Give them more of a yellow sense. Alright, so now I'll let that yellow blanket dry, because if I try to now paint the ladybug shape in there, it could be that the new paint from the ladybug shell would touch the yellow and then they would get sucked into drying out there. So you want to think about in terms of what is wet and what is dry for what you want to paint. So now we're doing the stems. We'll go through this one. Alright, hopefully the meadow is dry. It's not an irretrievable problem if this gets sucked out, but it's better not to have it happen. Alright, so it looks like it's staying pretty stationary. It's getting drawn out a little bit, but that's okay. I actually like it in pen and ink when the color goes a little outside the lines, because it gives that sense that... Sorry, my fish is trying to jump out of the fish tank for some reason. I don't know what he's doing. Is she? Alright. If you get your brush clean with water and then dry it off, then you can use it like a sponge to draw up paint when it's wet. So I'm drawing up a little bit of the paint. Oh, hold on a second, I will be right back. I'm going to check on my fish. Alright, well, I'm back. Not sure quite what happened to the fish. I have fed all the rest of the fish so that they stay distracted and away from him while he heals if he got himself hurt or something like that. But hopefully he will be okay. Alright, so we're letting the yellow of the blanket dry. We've got the green of the stems. We're going to do the dark green of the leaf. And these kinds of darker colors are ones that you'll probably need to put in multiple layers. So don't worry too much about the first layer that you put on being the final color, especially because, as we mentioned, these colors will dry later than when we sorry, they will dry later than what we put them on. So whatever we put it on, it'll get a little lighter, and then when it dries we'll take a look at it, and then we'll probably put another layer on, and so on. So at least we get a starting point here. And then a second layer for these stems. Alright, so while that is drying, go over to his chair. I want it to be a dark brown chair. I think that the meadow over here is dry enough that the brown should not leak out. We get the chair. I don't know what color book should I give him. It's going to be gray, and the brown of the chair, and the green. We could go with a red book, because we're going to have a red ladybug, and we've got red flowers in the background. So, you know what, I just keep using the same brush, because I can use the bigger parts of the brush for these big swathy parts, and then the little pointy part of the brush for the little detail parts. So in general, for something like this, I just find it easier to use one brush instead of using bunches of little brushes. But if you find it easier to use a smaller brush for some things and a bigger brush for other things, that is quite fine. Alright, so we got the book. I think the yellow should be dry enough. And I want to move reasonably fast in these videos so that you're not sitting around waiting for hours for paint to dry. And also, it gives that quick sketch feel to the whole image. You have a sense that someone just sat down and created something fairly spontaneously out of their mind, which is in fact what I'm doing. Alright. I'm not sure that that leaf is really done yet. And as much as I said that I don't mind the color leaking out of its location, I'm not too keen on this stem here have gone quite as far as it did, so I'm using just blank water to try to draw up this darker green where it escaped over here. There we go, that's better. Put in a little bit of the meadow green. There we go. Alright, I think it might be safe to put in the Ladybug's book, which I think I'll make brown. There we go. Alright, I think this leaf is mostly dry. To put in the gray of the mouse. Try to be careful not to get too close to the leaf so we don't get mouse gray all sucked into the leaf. Mouse body. So far so good. It is not leached down into the leaf area. Now we'll do the adult mouse. So I want to keep his eyeball white. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing a little bit of the paint off the littler mouse. I want to lighten it up a little, so I'm pulling a little bit of the pigment off onto my brush, and then I am putting it down over here onto this other mouse. So I'm sort of using it as a paint wall. And I don't know if you can see, but the littler mouse is getting lighter and lighter as I do this. So I'm drawing off the paint. And as I do, you can better see the white beneath it, and that means that it ends up looking lighter. Alright. Now that I've got the smaller mouse at the color I want, I'll use actual paint again from the paint tin to finish putting in the gray of the adult mouse. On one hand, the red of the book is spreading a little into the stomach area of the adult mouse, but on the other hand, I normally do that anyway. I add a little bit of red to the belly area, so that little happy accident is actually doing my job for me. I tend to put a little bit of red on the belly area and in the ears. Alrighty. I'll put a little bit more of the darker color along his back, which would be where the shadow is, and along the back of his head. This is a pretty two-dimensional cartoon style image, but even so you want to think a little bit about how the shadows will fall. That the baby mouse might be a teeny bit darker down along the bottom area where he's up against the leaf. And maybe not that much darker. So see, if I want to make it a little lighter, then I rinse my brush, I dry it off so it's just a little damp, and now it will act as a sponge and it will suck the paint right back off there again. There we go. I want it to be a little darker, but not enormously darker. Like that. That's what I'm looking for. A little darker. Alright, so he's got his book, like his fingers. It's a little tricky because that red is still wet. A little bit of black to put in the little ladybug head. And the ladybug back is still wet, so I don't want to touch that yet, because when black spreads it's really hard to get a handle on it and to be able to control that. Alright, so I may actually be done as much as I can do, because I'll come back later and add the spots into the ladybug, but it's going to take a while for that back to dry, and until that's dry I can't really put any more paint into that area because it would just spread out. Now it's funny, when I'm looking at my computer screen, because of the white balance, it looks much more washed out and white than it does in person. In person it is much greener and the colors are much fuller, so that's an interesting note on the way the screen is being lit by the camera. Wonder if I hold it up a little more, if it will show more accurately. I just have to give a second for my computer screen to catch up with what I am doing here to see what the result is. it goes. Yeah, it's a little better. It's still more washed out here in the computer version than it is in person. But in any way, you get a sense of how to do this sort of pen and ink and watercolor style, and also a sense of what wet on wet creates versus wet on dry in terms of the effects of the soft fuzzy background or the sharper, clearer foreground. So let me know if you have any questions about this. So it took about an hour. So if you've got an hour to sit down and do something, this is a fun way to doodle away at things and create some designs, and then the more you do it, the more you get a sense of what sorts of things you like to draw and what amuses you. Alright, so I'm going to carefully get that off the sketch pad. Often when I'm doing projects like Inktober, in which you do a painting a day on different kinds of themes, I just leave them all in the sketch pad and just, you know, spin them around to the next day and so on. But since we're doing a couple in a row right now, if I just spun this around, then all the wet stuff would get all messed up. And that would be a shame. So back and look at this one. You can see the paper's curling. So that's just something that happens with watercolor paper when you don't pre-wet it and flatten it out. But when you're done, if you just put this under a book, it'll flatten itself right back out again. So that is fine. Not something I worry too much about because I do a lot of sketching and practicing. Alright, anything else? I like to have pink ears. So, see there's already some red over here. I'll just wet up this red and use it because it's perfectly fine paint. Little pink ears. Give him a little tiny pink ear. There we go. And here he had a pinkish belly, but we'll just do a little more pink on the belly. And we'll just use a little bit of dry water to blend it a little at the edges. And again, that'll dry later than it's showing up. Alright, so we got a snoozy ladybug, got the reading adult one, the sleeping baby one. Alright, so then the next thing I often like to do with these kinds of flower scenes, and I'm going to have to move the fishy out of the way for this so it doesn't get contaminated. But here, if I show you with the other one, see how it's got that splattering of red and yellow and orange on it? I like that kind of feel to give it a gentle summery day kind of feel, or I suppose in this case a springy day kind of feel. So the way that one does that is one gets the other stuff out of the way, because this is going to splatter over things near it. So I'm going to get the brush wet, get some color on the brush. Let's go with this red. And then I'm going to pull it back and let it just spray. So it just goes wherever it wants to go. Let me take the paper out. Alright. It's just making a little light splatter. So depending on how high or low you are, some of these spots are a little bright. Not quite that bright. So if I go in with a wet brush, pulling out some of the brighter spots. One happened right next to the baby mouse's head. Not quite where I want it. So I should be able to gently scrub it back out again. Just didn't want a giant red splotch right next to his head, because he's one of the focal points of the painting. Alright, so again I'm just taking wet water and drying off the brush a little, so that's just a little damp, and just sort of scrubbing at this a little. Red happens to be one of the more staining colors, but I think I've mostly gotten it out. There we go. Right, so now back to the spattering. Get some orange in here. Actually, what I should have done, covered them up in paint so I don't get little spatters. Right, so now again, some little spots of orange in there. Orange is far less visible compared with the red. Rinse that out, and now go for the yellow. Alright, got some good yellow in there. Alright, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, a little bit of orange. I think I might put a little green in there too. Okie doke. Alright, so it just gives a gentle springy feel to it. I'm pretty pleased with that. Now part of me is thinking, well, it's splatterier over here and it's less splattery over there. But the last thing I need is more red splatter on this picture right now, so we'll just go with the way that it is. And that will be fine. Alright, so we'll put this over there, go back and check on the mousy thing. Anything else I want to do to the mousy world? I think I want to try to put a little H on the book, but I don't think I could do that with the watercolor. Let's see if I can do this. All right. Alright, I think I am reasonably pleased with the mousy and the dandelions. There's all sorts of other things I could add in, little butterflies and little dragonflies and all that other kind of stuff, but I think I will rein myself in. This is supposed to be a quick sketch. Nope, see, I'm tempted to do things. Nope, put it down. Right, so we'll call that one done for a sketch.